So, like I said, we're going to try to finish up the feasts of the Lord today, and I'm really excited for these fall feasts because the spring feast we looked at, um, well, let's just do a quick recap, obviously, because it's been a couple weeks. Um, what we started with last time was just understanding what the Hebrew calendar was, and this was actually ordained by God. You can kind of see from the beginning, but specifically with the law, when they came out of Egypt, that month that they were delivered was to be their new first month. This would be the beginning of months, and that was Nisan. And it wasn't called Nisan at the time. I forget what it was called. I don't know why they changed names, but it's the same month. Um, but one of the most important things for us to recognize when we're looking at these feasts is that they are not really feasts in the sense that we use the word today. These are the Lord's feasts, first off. So they're not Israel's. They have special reference importance to God Himself. And the word feast, it literally just means an appointment or a fixed time, or, here in Strong it says a festival. But when you look at what these feasts are, the RSV, I think, has the best rendering, and it calls them set times or appointments. And each feast was to begin on a very specific day. It says in the scriptures, everything had to be performed upon his day. I think I've even got that. Yeah. So it's Leviticus 23:37. So there's importance of the timing of when they follow these things. And we saw the reason for these being set times with the spring feast, because each feast referred to a very specific point in God's plan of redemption through Christ and showed the exact day and oftentimes the exact hour which that thing would be fulfilled. So, with the spring feast, this is what we saw. We saw that Passover that was fulfilled with when Christ offered himself and he died on Passover, which was Nisan 14. On the unleavened bread, this is when Christ had offered himself and had put away sin, and therefore he was in the grave on unleavened bread. He'd put away sin, he's buried. With first fruits, this refers to this resurrection day when Christ was raised from the dead on the third day, and he was waved before the Lord, because that's when they were supposed to wave the sheaf before the Lord to be witness before him. And so Christ was raised and appeared before the Lord on Nisan 17. And then Pentecost, which just means the 50th, 50 days, also called the Feast of Weeks. This was when, Pentecost occurred. The Spirit was poured out on the apostles, and with the feast, there were 2 wave loaves of leavened wheat bread. So it's not barley this time, it's wheat, and they were specifically leavened, showing that we are with sin, whereas Christ was not. And these were presented before the Lord. So this is the day when the Spirit was poured out, and they were out to preach the truth to Jews and Gentiles alike. So what's really amazing, and when we seeing this perfect precision on all these things, we see that God obviously knows the end from the very beginning, and he instituted these set times back in the days of Moses to teach Israel not only about how God's redemptive work would be accomplished, but also on what day, specifically what day each thing would be fulfilled. And when we look at the spring feast, it's without question. It was on these days Christ fulfilled them. So looking at that, let's look at the Hebrew calendar again and look at the fall feasts. Now, these were the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And we noted last time that all these spring feasts related to Christ's first coming, and now they were fulfilled in quick succession too. I mean, it wasn't like on Passover 1 year Christ was crucified, and then a year passed, and then on unleavened bread. This was in the same month on those days in quick consecutive order. And now after Pentecost, we know there's a big gap in time between the spring feast and the fall feasts. And then once we get to the fall feast, again, it's in quick succession, which is very interesting and was designed that way for a purpose. So obviously, I find I say this with every talk I give, but time's not going to permit for us to get into the depth of this as I think deserves to be done. But let's look at these fall feasts and see what they were to represent. Now, as with the spring feast, these were given at Sinai with the rest of the law. So there's no distinction when you read about these feasts of, all right, these are the spring feasts, these are the fall. They're very separate. It's just all one set of instructions they were giving. Uh, and it's interesting that, particularly with these fall feasts, much of what Israel kept and what they did for these feasts is not recorded in the scriptures. So the Jews added a lot of things to help make it practical or helpful to them. And a lot of these details we actually learn about in the Mishnah and the Talmud. But what's I think really interesting is when we go to the New Testament, it shows that a lot of these things that were instituted by the Jews were actually observed by Christ himself. And he wasn't saying, well, you guys have screwed this up so bad. Here's, you need to not do this. He kept it just as the Jews did in that day. So many, at least, of these additions were legitimate, just like we're commanded to, remember our Lord, but we have an exhortation. We add hymns. We have all these things to make it beneficial. And that's kind of what they did with some of these feasts. But there were some things, we'll mention at least one of them, that was not in their power to add, which they did, and just kind of screwed everything up. And all of these fall feasts, as you can see here, they took place in the 7th month. This month is called Tishri, and it goes to, which is September and October for us. Now, this is the 7th month of their religious year, but it's the beginning of their agricultural year. And this is the year that the Jews believed the earth was actually created. And as we'll see, this was the most important month of the entire year for the Jews. So as we learned last time, the Hebrew calendar is based off of moon cycles. Each month it begins with a new moon when it's dark. And each month was to have its own observances. With new moons, there were always these offerings that were to take place on the first day of the month. And it kind of acted to sanctify the rest of the month, similar to how when they offered the first fruits, that sanctified the rest of the crop of the land. In this book called Law and Grace, W.F. Barling writes, each new month was in effect a fresh beginning since the infant moon opened a new time cycle. It was therefore an appropriate time for Israel to remember its own beginning as a nation before God and to rededicate itself to his service. So just like the firstborn stood for the rest of the crops of the land, the sanctification of the first day of every month sanctified that whole month. And this was also accompanied by 2 silver trumpets being blown. But so that's the case for every single month. But when we come to the Feast of Trumpets, this is the 7th month. This day was very special. This is the 7th month, which means it's a sabbatical month. And it was on this day that the Feast of Trumpets was to be observed. So it was Tishri 1 that this took place. And while there are always trumpets being blown on the first day of the month, this one particularly, it was nonstop from all day long. Trumpets were being blown throughout the land. And I wonder if it got on some people's nerves, but it's very important that they did it this way. And it wasn't just the same blast. They had long blasts that were slow, and then they had short, quick ones. There was a very specific way they set it up. But the last blast was called the last trump because it's the last trump that they did. This was a very loud, prolonged blast that was as loud and as long as the blower could actually physically do. So it kind of determined on the person's lung capacity, but it was very loud and very long. And this day was to be a Sabbath, just like, and it actually had a lot more offerings required on this day than normal new moon days. But on top of their use on the new moons and the celebration of the feast days, there's a lot of purposes to the trumpets in scriptures. And what's really, if you look at Numbers 10, 1 through 10, we're just giving them all right down there. This is when the law was given, and God says, here's what you're to use the trumpets for. Obviously, a big point was to gain attention, but it was to be used, if you look up these verses, is to call an assembly to organize the movements of the camp of Israel, because there's a lot of people and they're different tribes. This is, and depending on the kind of blast and trumpet they were blowing, they could either summon just the princes, or they could summon everybody to the tabernacle. This was also used for the to declare the Jubilee And it was also to prepare them for war, to announce war. And it appears that in David's day, there were actually 7 trumpets used. And in Solomon's, there were 124. So it started out with just 2 silver trumpets that were made, that God commanded them to create. But as David and Solomon came on, the kingdom expanded. It seems like these trumpets were reproduced as well. Now, the silver trumpets were what they were supposed to use, but in later times, when they lost these trumpets, probably from the Babylonians when they spoiled Jerusalem, they didn't have trumpets anymore. And so from then on, they started using these shofars, and that's what they use today. Now, like the spring feast, we're going to see how all these fall feasts were first observed when Israel came out of Egypt. And, it's not like God just commanded them at the time. The first time they ever took place was when they came out of Egypt. And it's no strange thing, therefore, that the first time a trumpet is even mentioned in the Bible is in Exodus 19:13 when they're before Sinai. And what's really interesting about this feast is how and when it actually began. Because, new month started on new moons. But the downside to this is it can be really difficult to know exactly when a new month starts. It can either have 29 or 30 days, depending on, well, clarity of the skies. If it's a cloudy night, you're not going to be able to see if there's a new moon or not, because this is not a full moon. This is the new moon. No, we're seeing the completely shaded part of the moon. So if it's cloudy, you're not going to see this. It's just a big black spot in the sky where there's no stars. So that made it pretty difficult. But the importance of this is this begins not just their month, but especially with the Feast of Trumpets, they were to count the last 2 feasts of the year from this one. So if they screwed up this day, they also screwed up the next 2 to follow. So of all months, this is a very important one to get right. So they instituted something to kind of get around this. So what they did, and at least at the time of Christ, this is what they did. The Sanhedrin would sit in a hall and they would receive witnesses of the new moon. So it wasn't just one person. They had to have a lot of people come and say, yes, we saw the new moon kind of throughout the land where it might have been blocked by a cloud here, but if you go a couple miles this way, you could actually see it. So, and once they actually had determined that it was indeed a new moon, messengers were sent to signal. They went to the Mount of Olives where they had this fire beacon station. They would light the fire, and like you see in, I always think of Lord of the Rings, but there's other movies they show that in where they light a fire and it communicates to the next one, however far away, and they can spread the word throughout the land and to all the Jews in dispersion that this was a new moon, the new month was beginning. So the difficulty is that if you're just an Israelite, this new month could have started on the 29th or on the 30th at any time of day. And it would take a long time to spread this word. So especially if you're a Jew in dispersion, it's going to take you a while to learn about this. So here's what they did. This book here, it's called The Temple, Its Ministry and Services. It's absolutely excellent. I highly recommend it. But it says here, to make, however, assurance doubly sure, it soon became the practice to keep the New Year's Day on 2 successive days. So again, this is the beginning of their agricultural year. So this is talking about the month of Tishri. So what they're saying there is they would observe the Feast of Trumpets on 2 days because they wanted to make sure they got it right. And the purpose is they didn't know the day or the hour until the trumpet had been blown throughout the land. So they're waiting. They know, okay, it's going to be in one of these 2 days. They don't know the day or the hour, though, which is very interesting. So that's the Feast of Trumpets. On the 10th day of the 7th month, Israel was to keep the Day of Atonement. This was a holy convocation and a Sabbath as well, which means obviously there's no work to be done. But particularly with this feast, the aspect of no work being done was emphasized multiple times. And Israel was to afflict themselves and to fast and to really this whole day was to take a very hard, sober look at their sins, even sins of ignorance, and realize that they have those as well, and to acknowledge them. This was national atonement for Israel, but it was only for those who afflicted themselves. Anybody who did not afflict themselves and fast, they were to be cut off from the people, and scripturally that means to be killed. So that's very important. But because this was known as such a big fasting and important fasting time, it was sometimes just called the fast. And if you look at Acts 7:29, that's what it's called there. But the interesting thing is, it's not just for those who were Israelites by birth. It was for everybody who sojourned among them as well. If you look at Leviticus 16:29 and 30, says, "This shall be a statute forever unto you, that in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, ye shall afflict your souls and do no work at all, whether it be one of your own country or a stranger that sojourneth among you. For on that day shall the priest make an atonement for you, to cleanse you, that ye may be clean from all your sins before the Lord." And the way that atonement was made was very specific, and it all centered on one single man, as you see here, the high priest. If you look at Leviticus 16, it goes through this whole process of what they had to do. Um, the high priest who would first offer for himself, and then he could offer for, oh, then he'd offer for the tabernacle, and then for the people. And it was on this day and this day alone that he could go into the most holy place, because anybody who came into the holy place, which was a figure of the presence of God, if they did on the wrong day or in the wrong way, they were struck dead instantly. And therefore, when the high priest came out of the most holy place and was seen by all the people, this is proof that his offering had been accepted. Because if it was unacceptable, he would have been killed, and their sins wouldn't be forgiven. Um, and once he had atoned for himself, again, he would offer for the people. But then there was this very visual representation of this putting away of sin involved with this feast, and it involved 2 goats. So they would bring 2 goats into the camp. They were to be identical in as many ways as possible. One, they would cast lots for them. One would fall for the Lord, and one would be called the scapegoat. At least that's what the King James called it. The real word's something different. There's a lot of interesting things with that, but they were supposed to represent one and the same animal. That's why they had to be identical in size, weight, look, value, everything. So I tried to find 2 pictures of goats, but I ended up having to copy it because they don't have that many similar pictures online. But so the lots were cast, and the animal that fell to the Lord was offered for a sin offering. And then the priest would then place his hand on the live goat, which was called the scapegoat. It would be on this goat that he would place and confess all the sins of Israel. And then they would, as it says, lead this goat by a fit man into the wilderness where it would live. And this is a very different thing than would normally happen, because you think once they would put their hands on an animal's head and confess sins, that animal died, because that animal was, it's kind of like a transmission of the sins to that animal, and it therefore, took the sentence of death and it died instead. But here the animal lives, and it goes to a land not inhabited. And it shows that it's a very visual representation and foreshadowing of their sins being removed from them. And the Jews had, they eventually perverted many of these feasts, but probably none so much as Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement here. Because sometimes, if they didn't lead the goat far back and far away enough, the goat would come back, and they knew it was the same goat because they would tie this red ribbon to its horn. But the Jews looked at that as, our sins are returning to us. So in the time of Christ, what they would do is they would give the goat into the hand of a non-Israelite. They would set up these 10 stations, and that way they could all travel and hand the goat off without anybody actually walking too far and breaking the Sabbath. But to prevent it from coming back, they would actually throw it over a cliff so it died. That was not commanded in the law. And when you learn about what it's supposed to be, it completely destroys the figure of it. So if you see the Septuagint of Leviticus 16:26, you can see very clearly this was supposed to be alive. You weren't supposed to kill it. And there's a lot of different thoughts on what the scapegoat was to represent. And its removal from the camp, I think, is certainly showed that their sins had been removed from them. But the fact that the animal was still alive, I think, shows to me at least 2 things. The first is that it pointed to the insufficiency of the law to completely take away sins, because as we're told, it's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. Um, Now it showed that they had been atoned for, but their sins still existed out there in some form. That's at least what it seems to teach to me is, they could go out and they could find that goat that has their sins. So, it covered them, it removed them, but they're not fully blotted out. They're still findable, I guess, if you want to find them. But the higher purpose, I think, relates to Christ's death and resurrection. These two animals are supposed to represent one and the same thing. It's you have to have two that look the same because if you kill one, you can't resurrect it. So that's why you kill one and then you send the same looking one out into the wilderness that has the sins. So we have a figure of the death of an individual and the resurrection of that individual who is the sin bearer who continues to live on. And obviously that points to Christ. And in conjunction with this idea of putting away sins, it makes sense that the Jubilee year was only to be proclaimed on the Day of Atonement. And this was also brought in by the blowing of trumpets. So it's a very, very interesting feast there. It was on the 10th day of the month. And the final and the most joyous feast of the year, without question, was that of the Feast of Tabernacles. So this was on the 15th day of the month, 5 days after Yom Kippur. And it's interesting that, the Passover, which is the first feast, and Tabernacles, the last feast, both of them take place on the 15th day of the month. But the timing of this feast, of all things, is suggestive of great things because the 15th, if you start your month with a new moon, the halfway point is full moon. So this is, when the moon is at its fullest. But this is also when they had gathered in all of the fruit of the land, like grapes. So actually, the fruit itself. And it was therefore called the Feast of Ingathering. It's also just called the Feast sometimes. We'll read a little bit later about the time of Solomon. That's what they called it, because this is the time when all of their crops they're stored now, and the land just simply awaited the latter rains to soften it so they could plant a new crop. And this was to take place for 7 days. First of which, just like all the other feasts, really, there's holy convocation, no work to be done. And then offerings were to be made for the first 7 days, and the 8th day was to be another holy convocation and a Sabbath. So it's a complete contrast to Yom Kippur in that was to be a day of affliction. This feast was to be all about rejoicing before the Lord. They were told, "You shall take you on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, and the boughs of thick trees, and willows of the brook, and ye shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days." So those who were born Israelites, they would build booths or just basically temporary dwellings out of these boughs, and it was to remind them that God had made them to dwell in booths when they came out of Egypt, or tents, or just temporary dwellings. Um, and then some of these branches, there's different parts of the feast we won't talk about now, but they would also wave them for the Lord in all these different directions and things. But all of Israel, including the strangers in their borders, were to come up to Jerusalem to learn. And this is very interesting. Deuteronomy 31, 10 through 13 says, "And Moses commanded them, saying, At the end of every 7 years, in the solemnity of the year of release, in the feast of tabernacles, when all Israel is come to appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, thou shalt read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Gather the people together, men and women and children, and thy stranger that is within thy gates, that they may hear, and that they may learn, and fear the Lord your God, and observe to do all the words of this law, and that their children, which have not known anything, may hear, and learn to fear the Lord your God, as long as you live in the land." So this was not just about rejoicing in the Lord, but rejoicing in his law. What's also interesting about this feast is the number 7 is just all over it. It was in the 7th month, ran for 7 days, and all the sacrifices, except for the ones that were less than 7, obviously, are divisible by 7. And that's not true of the other feasts. And we know from the very beginning of creation, 7 represents completion. So the offerings of this feast are very telling. So on each day, there was a specific number of bulls, goats, sheep, goat kids, and so on that they needed to offer. Numbers 28, 12 through 39 records this. So on the first day, they were to sacrifice 13 bullocks, 2 rams, 14 lambs, and a goat kid. On the second day, they were to do 12 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs, and a goat. Third day, there was 11 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs, and a goat. So each day it would continue on. All the sacrifices would remain the same except for the number of bulls. So this would continue until the seventh day when there's 7 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs, and a goat kid. And then on the eighth day, it was supposed to be a solemn assembly. It was just 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 lambs, and a goat. So a total for the first 7 days, a total of 70 bulls, 14 rams, 98 lambs, and 7 goat kids. And then you have all these meat and drink offerings, which I didn't even mention with this. These were made. And it's interesting. We'll talk about this later, but it appears that these offerings were not for Israel because Israel was already atoned for 5 days prior on the Day of Atonement. So these actually had to do with the nations. And like I said, we'll talk about that in a minute. But the last thing on this feast is very interesting is that it is held, or we're specifically told that it was observed in the days of Solomon. Second Chronicles 5 all the way through 7 verse 22. That kind of shows all of this because Solomon gives this wonderful prayer, and that's what I encourage reading. But for our point and purposes right now, we'll just read some of these here. 5 verse 2 says, all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto the king in the feast, which was in the 7th month. Also at that same time, Solomon kept the feast 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great congregation, from the entering in of Hamath unto the river of Egypt. And in the 8th day they made a solemn assembly. They kept the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. And on the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people away into their tents, glad and merry in heart, for the goodness that the Lord had showed unto David and to Solomon and to Israel his people. And the reason they did this is because the temple had just been finished, and they were bringing the Ark of the Covenant so the Lord could dwell in the new temple or tabernacle in it. So let's look at the fulfillment of these feasts here. See what they foreshadow and teach. Now, like I said earlier, I think we have a big hint in the fact that we have this big time jump from the spring feast to the fall feast. But once the fall feasts begin, it's within 15 days. Well, actually, it goes the whole month, like, mostly, if you take into account the whole Feast of Tabernacles. But it's in fairly quick succession, and it's because these obviously have to do with Christ's second coming. And again, the fact that this all occurs in the 7th sabbatical month is not a coincidence. This is a month of rest. And this correlates to the beginning of the 7,000th year when Christ begins his reign and establishes the kingdom. So the Feast of Trumpets, like I mentioned, the timing of this specifically being ordained by God, each kept on its day being important. The Feast of Trumpets was the first day of the 7th month. It therefore marks a new and specifically a sabbatical age with Christ. Does this not perfectly show the beginning of Christ's reign on the earth? And it's interesting too that while the 7th month was the end of Israel's agricultural year and religious year, it also acted as the beginning of their civil year. So they had 3 different kinds of years, like how we have fiscal years and all that stuff. They have their religious and agricultural, then they have their civil year. And this month of Tishri was the end of 2 of those and also the beginning of the civil, which is really interesting because this seems to suggest the merging of religious and civil, because government today is very much so about the separation of church and state. But with Christ's kingdom, it's going to be, if you're going to label it, it's going to be a theocratic monarchy, which means it's a kingship based on religion. So, God's law is not just simply going to be, a religious law. It's going to be the law of the land, just as the law of Moses was for Israel when they were in the land. The Feast of Trumpets, representing both the religious and the civil year, teaches the beginning of when these two are merged forever, and it clearly shows the return of Christ to the earth. And we find this taught in many places. Numbers 10, those first 10 verses talking about the different uses of the trumpets. One of the most important functions was to gather Israel. And we find that the purpose of this feast is to teach about the return of Christ and the call to gather his saints for judgment. And this is something that we know is going to be announced by nothing other than a trumpet. A couple verses on this. There's a lot. We'll only mention 3 of them. And we'll see that a lot of times it specifically mentions the last trump. Matthew 24, 30 and 31. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Another one, 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 and 17. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout. And if you look up that word, it's the only place it occurs in the Bible. One of the meanings is a warning through a trumpet. So he'll descend with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God. And as a result of that, the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so shall we ever be with the Lord. Very clear things. The last one we'll mention is 1 Corinthians 15:52. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, for the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall all be changed. Have you ever read these and wondered, why is it always talking about a trumpet? Like, why that of all things? Why doesn't he just call to the earth and gather the saints? Well, it's because this has to do, it's literally the fulfillment of the Feast of Trumpets. That's what it was ordained to teach. And again, this last trump, it's the longest, loudest blast. And what's amazing is when we go back to Sinai and see the very first Feast of Trumpets, which was God gathered them out of Egypt, and God literally descended on the mount before them. That's exactly what we find. So this is the first occurrence of the word trumpet in the entire Bible. And note what kind of blast we find here. Exodus 19, 13, and 17. There shall not a hand touch it, talking about the mountain, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through, whether it be beast or man. It shall not live. However, when the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mount. And it came to pass on the 3rd day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. Now, the trump that they heard was the last trump, this long, very loud blast. And this whole account of them coming out of Egypt and coming before Sinai specifically is a figure of him gathering the saints for judgment. And that's why this feast was instituted. It's to tell and remind Israel, hey, remember when I came down the mount and you were all gathered before me and received this law? That's happening again. And you're going to observe this every year to remind you of that. It really is beautiful and difficult to express the beauty of it all. And the Lord even came down in fire. If you remember, the whole mount was up in flame, and fire is a symbol for judgment. And we find all of these same elements. If you go to Psalm 50, verses 3 through 5, this is actually about the return of Christ to gather his saints. All these same elements are here. It says, our God shall come, and he shall not keep silence. A fire shall devour before him, and it shall be very tempestuous round about him. He shall call by use of a trumpet, as you'll see, to the heavens from above and to the earth, that he may judge his people. Gather my saints together unto me, those that have made a covenant with me by sacrifice. It's just unspeakably beautiful that all of these things we find just that silver thread throughout the Bible. He comes down in fire, precisely as God did on Sinai. And again, this is to gather the saints, specifically what the trumpets were to be used for. Um, and again, if you go back to Exodus, it was the trump that summoned them to meet with God. And does that not show us being summoned to meet our Lord? And it's interesting too, who is gathered? It's not every nation, it's not every person. It's my saints, those that had made a covenant. And if you look back at Exodus, it was those who were delivered from Egypt by the blood of the Passover lamb. Because those are the ones that had made a covenant by sacrifice. So, this it's showing when Christ returns and gathers us for judgment, and therefore, this starts again. This is the beginning of the new moon of the seventh month, showing the rebirth and renewal, and specifically from that point forward, the moon's just going to get brighter and brighter and brighter, showing that Christ's rule will begin on that day and will grow from thence onward. And if you look, there's a number of other uses of the trumpets in the Kingdom Age, but this one specifically relates to Christ's return and judgment. So if that's what that refers to, what do we think atonement refers to? Again, this is taking place after trumpet, so it's got to be in the Kingdom Age. It's after we've been gathered and judged, and since it's only about 10 days, 10 days after this. After trumpets, we go. It's got to be fairly short in order. So, it was with this feast. Remember that the priest offered first for himself, then for the tabernacle, then Israel. Well, as we sit today, obviously Christ has offered for himself. He's cleansed us in the primary sense, at least, although we still await the redemption of the body, as it says. But the one thing that hasn't even remotely been fulfilled is Israel being cleansed. And again, if we look at this feast and read about it, this is national atonement. It's not just individual, it's as a nation. So I think Yom Kippur obviously relates in some senses to our full atonement at the judgment seat. I think specifically it refers to Israel's national atonement to come. And here's a couple reasons why. Remember, this is one of the most somber yet important feasts of the year. They were to afflict themselves and fully face their sins. The affliction, it says this just so many times throughout the Bible. It means to depress, abase self, or to afflict. It was a very painful process, obviously, but once they did this and the offerings were made, they were cleansed as a nation before the Lord. So again, this is national atonement. And with the events following Christ's return, just setting the feast and stuff aside, looking at what the rest of prophecy says, we know that once Christ has his multitudinous bride, their next thing that we find them doing is marching northward to save Israel from their Arab enemies. And if you look at Zechariah 12, it kind of gives us a pretty good chronological sequence of this. 12:2, this is when the armies attack Israel. 12:5 through 8, and then if you look in 14, verse 5-2, we see that Christ and the saints come to save Israel. Israel realizes, our strength is in the Lord of hosts, as it says. And then once the dust settles and the Psalm 83 nations are destroyed, we find this moment recorded. And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him, as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him, as one that's in bitterness for his firstborn. In that day there shall be a great mourning in Jerusalem, and the mourning as the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the valley of Megiddon, and the land shall mourn, every family apart, and it continues on. I mean, they recognize the greatest sin, which is still an ignorant sin to this day. They realize they crucified their Messiah, and they afflict themselves obviously as a result of that. And then if you look at the very next chapter, it says this: in that day there shall be a fountain open to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for what? It's for sin and for uncleanness. This marks the time when God's chosen nation of Israel is fully and finally reconciled to him through Christ forever. No more backsliding, no more going to other gods. This is the new covenant which he makes with Israel, as we learn about. And Jeremiah 31 says, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was a husband, and so on. But this shall be the covenant that I shall make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest. That's because he's in their midst. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember them no more. This is the day of atonement when Israel's sins are forever wiped away. Now, as Christ's return to Israel involves him also, this is saving them from their Arab enemies. This also marks a time when the promised land to Abraham and to his seed is finally inherited. Because if you look at the Psalm 83 nations, that's basically the land promised to Abraham from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. So here we see that these concepts of cleansing Israel and inheriting what's rightfully yours are tied together and accomplished by the same event. And a lot of us, I think, we're familiar with the Jubilee. That was every 50th year, and that's when all debts were to just be wiped clean. All the land had to go back to its original owner. Sins forgiven. And it's no coincidence then that the law dictates that the year of Jubilee could only be proclaimed on the Day of Atonement. It says, Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, in the Day of Atonement shall you make the trumpet sound. And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land, and to the inhabitants thereof. Ye shall return to every man his possession, and so on. And in verse 23, it even says, The land is mine. So this is when the land returns to the Lord. And it's just incredible, all the ties to this. It's fulfilled when Christ saved Israel from all these enemies around them. Now, another point with this, we see it reiterated that Israel must repent and be humbled before Christ appears to them, because with Yom Kippur, if they didn't afflict themselves, their sins weren't forgiven, but they were also killed. So in order for Christ to return, they have to acknowledge their sins and call to him, basically. And again, that's when we look at this proximal war, that's what we find. So we know trumpets, atonement. I think it's quite clear then what the Feast of Tabernacles refers to. And this is the last feast of the year. And again, simply way too short on time to go and do justice to this, but some of the major points we'll talk about. Yom Kippur was the 10th day. Sukkot, or Feast of Tabernacles, on the 15th day. And again, this is when the moon is at its fullest, and it reflects the maximum amount of light of the sun. And it speaks to the time when God's word fully illuminates the darkness of the earth. And this ran for 7 days, again showing completion of the 7th month. So this represents the entire reign of Christ here. It's the Feast of Tabernacles, called the Feast of Dwellings, and it's the time when the Lord would dwell or tabernacle among men. And what's really cool is when you look at prophecy, we see that this feast specifically is called out as being fulfilled in the kingdom age, or being observed. No coincidence if you go through Zechariah 14, after the Arab armies are destroyed, after Christ has cleansed them, Jews, it says, And it shall come to pass that everyone that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. And if the family of Egypt go not up and come not, yet have no rain, there shall be the plague, wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, and so on. It's beautiful. It's when Christ is dwelling in the land, that's when they're to come up and keep this feast. And again, the timing aspect's perfect. Christ and the saints has already gathered his saints, so trumpets is fulfilled. Yom Kippur is fulfilled, as Israel's now atoned for. And now, once the nations, I think as he expands his kingdom, all the nations that come into his reign are they're required to come up and keep this feast. So timing is perfect. Another place we read of this is in Isaiah 25, 6 through 8. And in this mountain, which shall be the new mountain in Jerusalem, shall the Lord of hosts make unto all the people a feast of fat things, of feast of wines on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, wine on the lees well refined. And he will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all people, and the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death in victory, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the rebuke of his people shall he take away from off all the earth. Um, here's again a feast. The people, the nations realizing and learning that, God is in their midst, wiping, or the Lord at least is in their midst, wiping away tears. And it's this same prophecy. If you look at Revelation, John is citing this prophecy in Revelation 21, 3 and 4. Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and no more sorrow, crying, or pain. And what's really beautiful is we see that this includes all nations conquered by Christ. And that obviously is going to encompass every nation on the planet, because that's what Christ is going to conquer. So this is the Feast of the Kingdom Age, but it's not just going to take place on the 15th day of the 7th month. This is the Feast of the Kingdom Age, and it's going to be observed on a monthly basis. As it says in Isaiah 66:23, it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. They're coming up again to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it's very logical that this is spread out throughout the entire year, because you can't fit every nation on earth in Jerusalem, even in the New Jerusalem. There's still the aspect of space. So I guess nations kind of take their turn from month to month and week to week, as it says, from Sabbath to another as well. They come up and worship. And we're given lots of glimpses of this feast fulfillment and prophecy. If you look back at Deuteronomy 31, which we read, the strangers in their gates, they all come up, they hear the words of the law, that they teach their children, that everybody gets to know and learn. Well, in Psalm 48, we have a fulfillment in the kingdom age itself. According to thy name, so is thy praise, O God, unto the ends of the earth. So the praise is not just in Jerusalem, it's throughout the end of the earth. Thy right hand is full of righteousness. Let Mount Zion rejoice. Let the daughters of Judah be glad because of thy judgments. And note this part. Again, they're coming up to Jerusalem. This is what they're told. Walk about Zion and go round about her. Tell the towers thereof. Mark ye well her bulwarks. Consider her palaces. Also that ye may tell it to the generation following. So this is all about the nations learning and coming and telling the people back home. Guess what we saw in Jerusalem? All the things that the Lord did. It's the fulfillment will be grand beyond comprehension. And if we're wondering what it's like, we just got to go back to the days of Solomon, and that's why I encourage reading this verse here in 2 Chronicles 5 through 7, because this was observed by King Solomon, who is the say latter day. Christ is obviously figured in Solomon, but this is when they brought the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. What better day to bring the Ark of the Covenant into the middle of Jerusalem to dwell, so God can dwell among them, than to do it on the Feast of Tabernacles. And not only that, when they put the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, they removed the staves. It had been the first time that the staves had ever been removed, showing it would never be removed from that. All of this showing that once Christ is in there, he's never being removed. And it reads, actually, that after they did this, the glory of the Lord was so full of smoke, and that the priest could not stand to minister by reason of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of God. That's what's going to happen in the future in a greater sense. But it's also interesting with Solomon that we have Christ as the antitypical Solomon, who's the seed of David, and we have two phases of Christ's reign. You have the David phase where he conquers, and because he's a man of war. But once that's done, you have the Solomon phase where it's just perfect peace and righteousness. And it's recorded that there was no war all the days of Solomon, and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and fig tree. Just so stinking beautiful. But there's more to it. You guys, I got a couple things left. You guys good me finishing this or okay. All right. So, where was I? So obviously, this is a time when no war occurs at all. And this obviously refers to the kingdom age and includes all nations. But what I was wondering, like, okay, well, how do you have such a grand aspect like that represented in a feast which just Israel kept? Um, well, again, I think there's two ways we see this. First is with the sin offerings of the Feast of Tabernacles. It's not for Israel because they're already atoned for on Yom Kippur. Um, so it makes sense that it's for other people. But the main thing is when we look at the number of the animals that were sacrificed, we find this. So if you remember, on the there's 70 bulls total slain throughout the 7 days. And what? Why 70? Why does it matter if there's 70? Well, it just so happens that 70 is the number of the nations. If you go back to Genesis 10, we have what's called the Table of Nations, and this lists every nation on earth at that time. It's the only such list in all the Bible, and if you count them up, you'll never guess how many there are. It's 70 exactly. So these bowls are to represent offerings for the nations when they're coming up to learn and to worship and to be cleansed. So they represent the nations. But what's even more beautiful is when you look at how they were distributed. I mean, you got 7 days, 70 bowls. If it were me, I think, well, just 10 bowls a day. That's not what God did. Why did he start with 13 and work his way down? Why is the number of bowls diminishing as each day progresses? Well, we saw obviously the 7 days of the feast represent the entirety of Christ's reign. And it's an age when there's no more war. Isaiah 2:4 is one place that says this, which means never again, ever. And once the nations are subdued, emphasis being on once they're subdued, the remaining nations aren't rebelling anymore. They realize their folly. It says the Gentiles shall come unto thee from the ends of the earth and shall say, surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit. So they're coming up to worship and learn. So as the kingdom age progresses, more righteousness ensues. And as it says here, the whole earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Last time I checked, sea's full of water. So, I mean, that's just complete permeation. We therefore, because of these things and the increase of knowledge and instruction, this is what we read about Christ's reign. It says, of the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom to order it and to establish it with judgment and justice from henceforth, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. So, in Luke 21:25, we're talked about the nations being described as the sea and the waves roaring. And this is right before Christ returns. But once they're conquered, look at how they're talked about. It's not sea and waves roaring anymore. It says, and I saw as it were a sea of glass. I know we've been on the lake before where it's just, there's no waves, nothing at all. It looks just like this picture here. Sea of glass mingled with fire. So it's peaceful with fire or judgment. And them that had gotten this victory over the beast, and over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of him, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. So this is after everybody's been conquered, and the saints stand on the nations, or so to speak, and they rule over the nations. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, great and marvelous are thy works, the Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy, for all nations shall come and worship before thee, for thy judgments are made manifest. So once they're conquered and these judgments are manifest in the earth, it's so peaceful that the nations are as smooth as glass. It's a very sharp contradiction to today, obviously. But therefore, as the kingdom age progresses, less offerings are going to be required because they're sinning less and less. I mean, that's the whole point of them coming up to learn and worship, is to sin less and less. So this is teaching of the endlessness of his peace and the gradual cleansing of sin throughout the evil world. And particularly when you get to the 8th day, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but You think of the concept of a rebellion at the end of the 1,000 years. I think that's one thing Brother Thomas believed. Not only do these verses that we look at show that that's just not, I don't see how it's possible. I mean, there's no end to the peace and increase of his government. If there's a huge rebellion, that's an end to peace. But when we look at the figures and the bulls and things, we don't find it either. I mean, you would expect there's a big rebellion that there's a lot of bulls at the end, but at the end, actually, we find just one on the 8th day. So it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And this last day of the feast, which is the 8th day, does represent the end of the millennial reign. It's the ultimate victory of Christ over all enemies, including sin and death. So this was, again, a Sabbath of rest. But the 8th day, it's also the first day of the next week. It's only 7 days in a week. And therefore, this marks a new beginning and correlates to God himself coming down and dwelling with man. This passage in 1 Corinthians kind of encapsulates all these different things we were just talking about. It says, then cometh the end. This is the end of Christ's reign after he's destroyed all enemies. When he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God, even the Father, when he shall have put down all rule and all authority and power, for he must reign till he hath put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. When all things shall be subdued unto him, then shall the Son also himself be subject unto him that put all things under him, that God may be in all. So all in all. So basically, once Christ is, sin and death are gone after the final judgment, Christ is completely victorious, gives the kingdom up to God, and God himself comes down and tabernacles amongst man. Sin and death are therefore at that point in time a fact of the past, no present reality at all, because all the forms and the roots of evil are gone. Is there any greater Sabbath of rest than that? So there's obviously a lot of the things we could talk about, but just all the feasts in general. There's a couple things I wanted to point out as far as lessons and meanings we get from this. First, obviously, with the feasts, we just see such perfect harmony throughout the rest of the scriptures and what we know about prophecy and things like that. Christ first, comes for his saints, then saves, cleanses Israel, then turns his attention to judgment of the nations, and it all starts with Christ in Jerusalem and expands outward from there. The second thing is just that this is back in the days of Moses, that even just the kingdom age and God himself coming down is figured. It shows God truly knows the end from the beginning. And it makes sense why he would call these things his set times. The third thing, and this has been the most interesting thing for me probably of all, is the importance of the day. It cannot be stressed how important it was that it was done on that day. With the spring feast, they were fulfilled on their specific days. And as all of these are set times of the Lord, we're kind of forced to the conclusion that the fall feasts would be as well. I mean, it's the same principle. But if you're like me, you think of that like, okay, well, this would seem to teach that we know on the Feast of Trumpets, Christ is going to return to gather his saints. Does that mean we know the day and the hour? Well, I looked into that, and all these verses that refer to that are these here: Matthew 24, 25. Mark 13 is a parallel passage. So there's really only two places in the Bible where it talks about this, where it says, no man knoweth the day or the hour. So why would God tell us with the feast, all right, it's happening on this day, but also you don't know the day or the hour? But again, this is the Feast of Trumpets, and if you go back to that, that was the day or the hour. That's a title of this Feast of Trumpets because they didn't know. If you're a Jew, it could have happened on the 29th or the 30th, any hour in that time, you don't know. It specifically only relates to that feast. So, it's literally true. They didn't know the day or the hour when this feast would begin. So it seems like it's just a title of the Feast of Trumpets. So when Christ says, you don't know the day or the hour, it's Feast of Trumpets, which is very, very interesting. So personally, I find it difficult to evade that conclusion because if you say that the fall feast won't be fulfilled on their specific days, we have to ask why and on what basis, because there's no distinction given from the spring feast. So take that for what you will. Obviously, we need to always be ready, but the more I've looked into this, the more it's just like, especially with Solomon and all these things, the Feast of Tabernacles being fulfilled on that day and the ark being brought in. It's just very, very interesting. And the last thing, obviously, is we kind of get into memorials. I think this helps us understand and appreciate um, God's wrath nature with Israel with these feasts. Here he says in Isaiah 1, bring no more vain oblations, incense is an abomination. The new moons and Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hateth. They are a trouble unto me. I am weary to bear them. What was intended to exhort and teach and educate was misused and abused by Israel to the extent that the Lord detested their observance of these things. They were just going through the motions. And we can't help but apply that principle to the Passover and the memorial emblems, which, this is where the emblems are taken from. It's from Passover. Um, these point back to Christ's death, but also to the future when he's going to um, partake of these things in our midst. And we have to ask ourselves, like Israel, do we ever just go through the motions? Would the Lord ever say of us when we're breaking bread and partaking of the wine, bring no more offerings, drink no more bread or wine, your memorial service my soul hateth, they're trouble to me. It's something I know I'm personally guilty of not even just being mentally present. But that's why we're here. We're commanded to partake and examine ourselves and discern his body. And just as Israel's feasts show these wonderful things the Lord will accomplish in the future, so our partaking of this bread and wine shows his death till he comes and shows the time we'll have him in our midst doing this. So what a wonderful thing we've been offered a part in. And it's all because of our Lord's offering of himself. So to prepare for memorials, I'll just read the account in Matthew 26. Matthew 26, starting in verse 26. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, drink ye all of it. For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And when they'd sung an hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. In like manner, let's ensure we're keeping this memorial with our minds and our hearts and truly discerning our Lord's body and examining ourselves.